What if Wolverine dropped into the lands between? Today we're exploring how Wolverine would handle the world of Elden Ring, his claws, his regen, and the chaos he'd unleash. Let's not waste a second. Please like and subscribe, and let's jump straight into it. He arrived not in a flash of light, but with the visceral shock of impact. Wolverine hit the cold, scarred stone of the lands between with the force of a small meteorite, shattering the ancient pavement and burying himself several feet deep in the wreckage of a nameless ruin. The air was heavy with the smell of sulfur and dust, and the sky was dominated by the unsettling, sickly glow of the massive Erdtree. He was wearing his usual civilian gear, jeans and a tank top, which were immediately ripped and bloodied by the debris and the sheer force of his arrival. He felt the initial concussion and the deep, throbbing ache in his adamantium skeleton, a familiar pain only his unique internal structure could transmit. But the healing factor was already furiously at work, knitting the soft tissue and sealing the superficial wounds before he could even consciously register the pain. He climbed out of the crater, his 3 bone claws instinctively popping from his knuckles and then retracting, a primal defense mechanism, as he took in the scene. This was not the familiar chaos of the savage land, nor the twisted, technological futures of his past. This place felt ancient, saturated with a cold, malignant magic that hummed in the very stones and permeated the ruined, Gothic architecture that stretched to the horizon. He had no memory of how he got here, only the sudden, violent translocation, a feeling of being ripped from one reality and violently slammed into another. He heard the first sounds of trouble, a guttural, wet dragging noise, like a bag of broken meat being pulled across coarse sand. From the shadows of a ruined chapel shambled the grafted scion, a grotesque horror of too many limbs, blades, and eyes, its movements jerky, unnatural, and profoundly disturbing. It was the perfect initial test for this world. It was huge, ugly, and moving with obvious intent to kill. Logan did not hesitate. He sprang forward with the savage, animal speed that defined him, his muscles coiling and unleashing the kinetic energy stored within his dense frame. The scion lunged with twin curved swords, blades meant for massive hands, but Logan dodged low, rolling beneath the clumsy, multi-directional swipe. He didn't use the claws for simple defense. He used them for efficient, lethal offense. He drove a single, foot-long adamantium blade into the creature's main torso, not through the thick plate armor, but finding a seam between the monstrous grafts, ripping a massive channel of flesh and corrupted, brittle bone. The scion roared, more in confusion at the sudden, unnatural wound than in actual pain, and tried to backhand him with 4 different, smaller arms. Logan ducked and weaved, an impossible blur of controlled motion, avoiding the chaotic, flailing attacks, his healing factor shrugging off the few grazes that managed to connect. He targeted the nexus of the grafts, the central, primary spine where the horrors converged and drew their sick power. In a final desperate leap, he plunged all 6 adamantium claws deep into the creature's primary neck, a quick, brutal chop that severed the core connection between the brain and the grafted extremities. The scion collapsed, its many limbs twitching violently for several seconds before falling utterly still, a mountain of cooling, metallic blood and discarded flesh. Logan stood over the creature, breathing heavily, the adrenaline finally starting to course through his system. The fight had been brutal, fast, and ultimately decisive. He knew 2 things instantly that solidified his grim survival chances. His adamantium claws could slice through the armor and corrupted bone of this world's monsters, and his healing was more than a match for their brute, physical attacks. But the sheer ugliness of the creature, the unnaturalness of its death, and the way it was stitched together from the unwilling flesh of others left a cold knot of dread in his stomach. This was not a world of simple brutes or alien invaders. It was a world of conceptual horror and profound, self-inflicted decay. He retracted his claws, the sounds of distant battle echoing across the vast, ominous landscape of Limgrave, the massive golden light of the Erd Tree mocking him from the distance. He was alive, he was capable, but he was profoundly alone, and he had absolutely no idea how to get back home. He spent the next 3 months simply surviving in the haunted realm of Limgrave, moving from ruin to ruin, a phantom observing the local populace, the desperate and the irrevocably mad. He noticed the bizarre pattern of the local warriors, the so-called Tarnished, who would fight and die only to dissolve into harmless golden motes of light and reappear hours later near shimmering pillars of light, the so-called sights of grace. He was intensely curious about this phenomenon, his survival instincts demanding he understand the rules of this impossible reality. He decided to test the theory himself. He approached a patrolling tree sentinel, the massive, imposing knight on its armored golden horse, and provoked a full-on charge, an action he knew would result in total destruction. The tree sentinel's golden lance struck him with the force of a train and the precision of a celestial hammer, piercing his torso and throwing his dense, heavy body 100 feet through the air. He felt the immediate, sickening trauma, the temporary shutdown of his vital organs, the searing, unimaginable pain of his adamantium skeleton being temporarily rattled. But as his body tumbled through the air, his healing factor immediately engaged, stitching the wound closed and rapidly restoring his shattered ribs and shredded organs. He reappeared near a site of grace only by sheer coincidence, having physically dragged his unconscious, healing body there through pure animal will. But the golden light did not acknowledge him, did not claim him, and did not dissolve his body into motes of light. He simply repaired. This was a terrifying, absolute confirmation of his isolation. He was not blessed by the grace of this world. He was not part of the system. His one life was all he had, meaning any magic or conceptual force that could bypass or permanently disable his unique regenerative powers was a final, absolute, and permanent end. His survival strategy shifted instantly from aggressive predator to highly cautious, focused operative. He needed to understand the destructive, systemic magic of the demigods and the fractured law of this decaying world. He scavenged materials, crafting thick, layered leather armor and a sturdy hooded cloak to conceal his identity and his unnatural physique. His enhanced senses became his primary weapon, allowing him to smell the deep corruption, hear distant, crucial conversations, and track patrols from miles away. He gleaned the fragmented, terrifying history from nervous travelers and cryptic merchants. The world was shattered, ruled by monstrous, incestuous tyrants who possessed pieces of the Elden Ring, the Great Runes. He learned of Godric the Grafted, the first obstacle, a repulsive figure obsessed with torturing people and stitching the unwilling limbs of others onto his own body. The tales of Godric's horrific vanity, the screams of the victims, and the massive piles of discarded, failed flesh resonated deeply with Logan's oldest, most painful, and most profound trauma: the forced, unwilling procedures of the Weapon X program. He instantly recognized the pattern of the scientist-turned-monster, the tyrannical obsession with flesh and control. He wasn't seeking a great rune or a throne. He was seeking a monster to put down. His moral compass, rusty but true, pointed him directly toward Stormvale Castle. The mission was simple, uncomplicated, and absolute: stop the torturer and end the grafting. The massive walls of Stormvale Castle were not a challenge to be conquered, but a logistical puzzle to be solved. Logan avoided the main gate, which was heavily fortified and guarded by the massive, imposing figure of Margit, the Fell Omen, and instead found a hidden path up the jagged, treacherous cliffs near the coastline, a route deemed impossible by normal men. He used his adamantium claws to dig handholds directly into the sheer, ancient rock face, finding fissures and purchase in the stone that no one else could access. The vertical ascent took an entire grueling night, his dense muscles screaming with strain, the absolute adrenaline of pure focus overriding the deep exhaustion and the constant, low thrum of the great rune madness he had yet to absorb. He slipped into the castle through an unguarded parapet near the ramparts, immediately finding the air thick with the metallic stench of blood and the deeper, sickening scent of decay, fear, and human cruelty. His initial goal inside the castle was reconnaissance, not fighting. He needed to find a structural weakness, a route that led directly to Godric himself, and a thorough assessment of the castle's tactical and magical layout. He moved through the abandoned wings and the horrifying torture chambers, confirming every brutal rumor he had heard. Godric was not just a warlord. He was a paranoid sadist, his halls lined with the fresh grafts of human limbs, his simple, disposable guards nothing more than extensions of his immense, pathological paranoia. This was not a fortress, but a self-sustaining slaughterhouse of vanity. His planned patrol route was interrupted by Margit, the fell omen, who materialized from the shadow of an archway with a suddenness that still managed to surprise Logan. Margit was immediately different from the mindless beasts he had fought. His stance was disciplined, his eyes full of cold, zealous, unwavering duty. Margit summoned a spectral, golden holy blade, a weapon crackling with soul-searing magic, the kind of conceptual attack Logan had been warned could bypass even his internal defenses. The ensuing confrontation was a violent collision of raw, animal aggression and cold, divine discipline. Logan roared and charged, his 6 claws extended, aiming for a quick, brutal decapitation, a swift end to the conflict. But Margit was too fast, his defensive movements unnaturally precise, calculated, and efficient. The omen met Logan's adamantium claws with a staff block, the sheer force of the impact shaking the very stone of the castle, then followed with a rapid, controlled thrust of the holy blade. Logan took the direct hit on his adamantium forearm, the powerful blade bouncing harmlessly off the indestructible metal. But the immense magical energy transferred through the bone, bypassing his healing and hitting his nervous system like 1,000 continuous volts. The pain was immediate and conceptual, burning not just the flesh, but the will to fight, attempting to short-circuit his very identity. Logan staggered back, his healing factor furiously battling the mystical corrosion, his muscles twitching involuntarily. Margit paused, seeing the alien, impossible resilience in the ragged man, recognizing that this was not a simple Tarnished driven by gold or ambition. Logan growled low, the pain driving him towards the absolute edge of his berserker rage, but he forced the crimson impulse down, needing control more than release. He saw the cold, deep duty in Margit's burning eyes, the spiritual weight of his oath. Logan spoke, his voice a low, guttural rasp, filled with absolute conviction. "I'm not here for your god, your gold, or your throne. I'm here for the man who cuts people up and stitches them to himself. If you protect that monster, I'll carve you first." Hearing the pure, unselfish hatred for torture in Logan's voice, recognized a different kind of motivation, one that transcended the petty ambitions of the Tarnished and the demands of the greater will. The omen hesitated for a crucial, silent moment, his duty warring with his understanding of Godric's true corruption. He finally lowered his spectral staff, slowly stepping aside, allowing Logan to pass deeper into the castle. The omen knew Godric was an abomination, a mockery of the shattering, and this quiet, scarred warrior might be the only force capable of delivering the necessary destruction. Logan spent the rest of the 4th month planning the final confrontation with Godric. The demigod's massive, multi-directional attacks and grotesque size were too dangerous to engage head-on, even with his healing factor. He realized he needed a tactical disadvantage and an exploit to bypass Godric's massive vitality. His initial idea of a toxic agent was too risky. Godric was paranoid, and his food would be tested. But his profound obsession with grafting was the true, deep weakness. Logan found the demigod's main supply of embalming fluids and preservative resins, specialized chemicals used to maintain the freshly cut, living grafts, keeping them viable until they could be stitched to his main body. These materials were stored in vast, copper vats beneath the throne room. Logan spent days carefully introducing potent catalytic toxins into the fluids, designed not to kill, but to cause catastrophic, systemic rejection when the fluids were absorbed into the demigod's body through the open wounds of the grafting process. The goal was to force Godric's massive immune system to violently attack his own grafted limbs, turning his vanity into his greatest liability. The confrontation began with a roar of pure, egotistical vanity from Godric, who had finally sensed the deep intrusion. The demigod was massive, a living, moving mountain of flesh and stitched appendages, swinging two gigantic axes with his primary arms, while the smaller, grafted limbs flailed around him in chaotic, unpredictable patterns. Logan immediately targeted the nearest vat of treated fluid, slicing it open with a precise, powerful strike of his claws. The toxic resin spilled onto the floor, and Godric, in his panic and rage, instinctively absorbed a huge amount of the fluid through the open pores and surgical stitches of his monstrous body. Drawn to the sight of his vital supplies being spoiled, the effect was immediate and sickening. The smaller arms began to seize and twitch violently, unable to obey Godric's commands with precision. The grafts were actively rejecting the host. Godric lunged, his attack wide, powerful, and utterly driven by blind, uncontrolled rage. But Logan was already ready, anticipating the clumsy, frantic movement. He moved with impossible speed, dodging beneath the arc of the main axes, his body a blur of cold, controlled motion, powered by his adamantium skeleton. He aimed specifically for the seams, the grotesque surgical stitches where the flesh met flesh, the points of weakest connection. He unleashed his claws, his foot-long adamantium blades slicing through the tough rubbery hide and the reinforced iron plating that secured the grafts. He was not engaging in a fair fight with the demigod. He was performing an expert, rapid surgical dismemberment, forcing the systemic failure of the creature's entire structure. He shredded the tendons and severed the ligaments of a huge stolen arm, and the limb collapsed instantly, dragging uselessly on the ancient, scarred stone of the throne room. Godric shrieked, a sound of pure pain, impotent rage, and profound humiliation at the rapid, systematic destruction of his precious trophies. The demigod stumbled backward, a river of dark, metallic blood pouring from the many severed connections. In a moment of absolute, horrifying desperation, Godric reached down and tore a dead, calcified dragon head from a nearby carcass pile, the discarded proof of some previous brutal hunt, fusing it to his shoulder with a sickening, wet, audible sound. Phase 2 began as the dragon head roared, unleashing a wave of white-hot magical flame that swept across the courtyard, instantly turning the air into a shimmering heat haze. The heat from the dragon fire was immediately conceptually intense, far hotter and more pervasive than any conventional flame Logan had ever encountered in his 2 centuries of warfare. Logan felt his already tattered clothes incinerate instantly, and his exposed flesh began to smoke, bubble, and blister in seconds. His healing factor kicked into a hyperdrive overdrive, battling the immense thermal damage and the magical essence of the flame itself. His outer layers of skin bubbled and peeled away, exposing the glistening red muscle beneath, but the underlying tissue immediately began to regenerate, growing back faster than the flames could destroy it. He became a terrifying, impossible sight, a naked, muscle-bound skeleton of adamantium, walking directly through the magical fire, his body constantly steaming and reforming in the blaze. The flames could burn him, they could inflict agonizing pain, but they could not stop him. Godric shrieked again, his voice cracking with animalistic fear and utter confusion at the sight of the impossible creature walking through his ultimate, devastating weapon. Logan used the demigod's momentary paralysis and confusion, charging directly through the blaze, ignoring the immense, searing pain that threatened to send him into a complete, mindless berserker rage. He had to maintain absolute control, or the creature he despised would become the creature he was. He reached Godric and leaped onto the demigod's primary shoulder. Godric tried frantically to shake him off, batting at him with his remaining functional arms, but Logan's adamantium claws were sunk deep into the collarbone and the neck, his grip absolute and unbreakable. He reached the base of the dragon head, the source of the terrible, cleansing heat. Logan aimed his claws at the exposed, wet base where the head was newly grafted to Godric's shoulder. He plunged all 6 claws into the junction and pulled, using the full, massive, immovable leverage of his adamantium skeleton. With a horrific tearing sound, like wet silk and iron being ripped, the dragon head was torn clean from Godric's shoulder. The fire stopped instantly, the magical conflagration extinguished by the destruction of its physical source. Godric collapsed, the mountain of flesh shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors, the internal rejection of the toxic fluid finally overwhelming his system. Logan stood on his chest, breathing hard, his body visibly healing at an incredible rate, his skin growing back over the exposed muscle in mere seconds. He was whole, but profoundly and utterly exhausted. He plunged his claws into Godric's primary heart, ending the demigod's pathetic, miserable existence with a final, deliberate twist. It was a clean kill, but it brought him no satisfaction, only the grim, chilling knowledge that a monster had been put down and his trauma had been avenged. The consequence of the kill was immediate and non-physical. A massive, pulsing orb of corrupt golden light, the Great Rune, emerged from Godric's chest and dissolved with a sickening flash into Logan's body. The sensation was immediate and profound. A tidal wave of overwhelming vanity and madness flooded his mind, threatening to consume his very identity and all 200 years of hard-earned self-control. It was a psychic violation, the twisted, arrogant residue of Godric's demigod power trying to utterly corrupt his soul. Logan collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, fighting a silent internal war for his sanity. He locked the intrusive madness down, forcing it into the darkest, deepest corner of his mind, sealing it behind the unbreakable, metaphorical iron walls of his own unbreakable will. He had won the battle, but he had tragically absorbed the spiritual rot of his enemy, adding a constant, corrosive voice to his internal monologue. He was now 6 months into this nightmare, a survivor holding a piece of a broken god, his clock ticking faster and louder than ever before. The fight against Godric had taught Logan that brute force against magical corruption only resulted in a deeper, more profound infection. The Great Rune of Vanity was a constant, heavy internal weight, a low, maddening hum of paranoia and self-loathing that he fought every waking moment. He left Stormvale Castle behind, seeking a path that led away from conquest and toward a deeper, desperate understanding of the world's fundamental decay. He journeyed toward the horrifying landscape of Caelid, the land of the scarlet rot, the conceptual plague that had once crippled Radahn and scarred the entire region. He needed to understand the nature of non-physical decay, the one thing that truly scared his healing factor. By the 8th month of his exile, the landscape of Caelid was a hellish vista of fungal growths, corrosive red soil, and towering, rotting organisms, the sight of which defied natural biology. Logan wore a thick, multi-layered cloth mask that he kept perpetually soaked in scavenged antiseptic, a flimsy, desperate barrier against a god's biological plague. He moved through the crimson wasteland with absolute, necessary caution, his enhanced senses picking up the invisible airborne spores and the subtle movements of the corrupted creatures that shambled through the toxic landscape. The scarlet rot spores constantly and mercilessly attacked his system, microscopic seeds of magical decay attempting to take root in his organs, and his healing factor was forced into a state of continuous, agonizing defense, fighting a constant, invisible, molecular war against the mystical corrosion. He came across Millicent, a young woman showing the devastating flowering signs of the advanced rot, her arm a terrifying mix of flesh and blooming, red fungal horror. She was resigned to her fate, seeking only to understand her destiny and the finality of her coming death. Logan, remembering the innocent, young lives he had failed to save, the lost students of the Xavier School, the countless victims of Weapon X, felt a primal, necessary revulsion and could not simply walk away from this innocent suffering. He felt the cold knot of determination tighten in his gut. "I will find what you need," Logan stated, his voice quiet but firm, filled with a grim promise. "Just stay put and try to rest." He learned from her and the cryptic servant Gowry that the only countermeasure to the advance of the plague was the unalloyed gold needle, a tool crafted by the demigod Miquella to halt the rot's progression, a physical tool capable of conceptual intervention. Retrieving the needle was not a simple act of scavenging. It required confronting Commander O'Neill, a massive, mad general guarding the heart of the most toxic area of the Aeonia swamp. Logan knew a direct, close-quarters fight would be disastrous, given the toxic environment that was already pushing his healing factor to the absolute limit. He studied the general's movements for 3 days, noting his reliance on his mounted forces and the predictable, slow routes of the spectral, summoned soldiers that protected him. Logan crafted crude but highly effective corrosive acid traps using local, highly flammable resins, scavenging corrosive plant matter, and thick oil. He mined the narrow, dry paths leading to O'Neill's elevated position, creating multiple pressure-activated, high-temperature ignition points. He used his claws to silently sever the primary tendons of O'Neill's massive warhorse, immobilizing it and forcing the general to engage on foot in the thick, corrosive waters. When O'Neill finally patrolled, Logan detonated the traps, forcing the general into the deepest, most concentrated part of the swamp, compromising his mobility and dissolving his armor. The general's massive armor dissolved rapidly under the combined assault of the intense acid and the swamp's highly concentrated rot's water, compromising his mobility. Logan engaged, not fighting the general as a warrior, but fighting the armor, stripping the man of his protection, using his claws to surgically disable O'Neill's limbs, ensuring a kill that was swift and merciful, not prolonged or filled with torture. He retrieved the unalloyed gold needle from the fallen general's corpse, but not without a catastrophic personal cost. During the close-quarters fight, a thick cloud of highly concentrated rot spores washed over him. He felt the cold, invasive corruption hit his bloodstream, a terrifying, new feeling entirely different from the burns of fire or the shock of steel. It was conceptual decay taking hold in his deepest cellular structure. The scarlet rot was now an eternal, agonizing companion. The infection had taken a permanent hold, but his relentless healing factor was locked in an unending, microscopic war against the magical corruption. Every millisecond of his life was now defined by a searing internal battle, a constant low thrum of generalized pain that tested the very limits of his sanity and his 2 centuries of endurance. The rot was consuming and rebuilding his cells simultaneously, forcing him into a state of perpetual internal combustion, a biological paradox. He realized with cold horror that he would never fully heal from the rot. He would merely fight it until the day he finally died, a fate worse than any physical wound. He returned immediately to Millicent and, with grim precision and absolute focus, inserted the unalloyed gold needle into the decaying flower bud on her arm. The result was immediate. The spread halted, the decay paused. He had saved her life, but he never told her the permanent, terrible cost. He carried the rot alone, a dark, agonizing secret that tied him irrevocably to the decay of the lands between. With the immediate threat to Millicent neutralized, Logan focused on his next target, Starscourge Radon, the massive general who had been driven mad by the rot. He knew he needed to move quickly, as the internal struggle was weakening his control, and the psychic remnants of Godric's rune were constantly whispering of absolute power, trying to leverage his pain to seize control. The rot-induced agony was the new normal, a constant, unbearable weight that made every movement a supreme act of will. He had become a monster of compassion, sacrificing his own well-being to save an innocent in a world that had forgotten the concept. He realized he was now fighting not for survival, but for the moral right to die, a final, necessary end to his 2 centuries of suffering. The tragedy of Radon, a noble warrior corrupted, called to him like a dark mirror of his own fate. He prepared for the journey to the Wailing Dunes, knowing this confrontation would either end his agony or cement his purpose as the world's unwanted executioner. Logan focused on the bleak tragedy of Starscourge Radon. He learned that Raiden was once a noble general, a warrior who loved his undersized horse and his people, now reduced to a feral, starved beast by the unchecked spread of the scarlet rot. Logan recognized the terrible, familiar tragedy of the man who could not stop fighting, a hero cursed by his own power and duty, twisted into a monster. He saw his own grim reflection in Raiden's story, a weapon that couldn't be controlled, a force that couldn't find peace. He felt a profound sense of kinship and duty toward the fallen general. By the 10th month of his exile, he traveled to Caelid's Wailing Dunes, the site of the festival, a ceremony of mercy where the scattered warriors gathered to deliver the afflicted general an honorable, merciful death. Logan arrived, not as a participant seeking glory or a piece of the Elden Ring, but as a silent, grim mourner and executioner. He stood alongside the other warriors, his grim focus absolute, the low burn of the rot in his veins mixing with the psychic weight of Godric's great rune. The battle was not a fight. It was an endurance test designed for gods. Radon, massive and driven mad, began the fight by pulling meteors from the very sky, raining colossal magical destruction upon the dunes. Logan did not try to dodge. He charged, knowing evasion was impossible. He was crushed repeatedly. He felt the sickening, terrible crunch of his adamantium skeleton being temporarily distorted, his dense body compressed into a pulp by the immense force, only for the healing factor to instantly knit him back together, piece by piece, organ by organ. He would be vaporized, then regenerate. He would be buried beneath tons of sand and debris, then claw his way out, rising again like a bloody, impossible ghost. He kept charging forward, a furious, unstoppable force of pure animal will, while the less resilient warriors around him dissolved and reappeared at the sight of grace, or simply lay permanently dead, their cycles of resurrection finally failing. Logan used the utter chaos of the environment to his advantage, calculating the impact zones, and moving with the unpredictable agility of a predator, exploiting the momentary distractions of the other, more powerful warriors. He did not seek to wound Radon. He sought to survive the impossible bombardment and reach the suffering general. His goal was purely tactical: to draw the general's fire and create openings for the Tarnished to advance, knowing he could absorb damage that would instantly kill everyone else. He became a living shield, a human-shaped cannonball that refused to be stopped. After what felt like 100 cycles of death and regeneration, his healing factor screaming its agony, Logan finally reached Radon, the massive, broken general. The rot had ravaged Radon's mind and body, but in the fleeting depths of his eyes, Logan saw a raw, fleeting moment of self-recognition, a desperate, silent plea for an end. Logan sheathed his claws, refusing to kill a man who deserved better than a beast's death. He looked up at the broken general, his voice quiet but firm. carrying the absolute conviction of one soldier speaking to another soldier. "You were a hero. You were a noble soldier. Now it is time to rest, General." He didn't use the claws. He used the combined brute force and immense weight of his adamantium body, leveraging his strength, driving the broken general to the ground, forcing the final surrender. He landed a series of crushing, precise blows to Radahn's massive armor, targeting the seams in the chest plate, the pressure points that controlled the general's breathing, forcing the life from him without tearing his flesh. He didn't stop until Radahn was completely immobilized, the general's massive bulk finally falling silent. Logan then delivered the coup de grace, not with his claws, but with a piece of the general's own broken sword, which he had snatched from the sand, driving it deep into the one unprotected area of his throat. It was a kill rooted in mercy, a final act of respect for the tormented man Radahn had been before the plague. The moment of death was immediate and profound. Another great rune of shattered power, tainted with the madness of rot and perpetual warfare, entered Logan's system. He collapsed again, the psychic invasion doubling the agony already caused by Godric's rune. His internal battle intensified to an unbearable pitch. The vanity of Godric and the feral war madness of Radahn were now locked in a violent, psychological struggle within his skull, threatening to push him into a permanent, destructive berserker rage from which he would never return. He clawed at the sand, forcing himself to breathe, locking the two conflicting voices, the arrogant whisper of control and the guttural scream of perpetual war, behind the steel wall of his will. Logan stood up, scarred and trembling, his resolve intact, but his body now saturated with the toxins and spiritual rot of the lands between. He was a walking repository of conceptual decay and madness. He knew he had reached his moral limit. He had killed 2 demigods, and each victory was a step closer to his own permanent, internal collapse. He had to face the source of the plague itself, Malenia, the goddess of rot, the one who had condemned Radahn to this fate. He sought her out, knowing that facing her meant facing his own death, but also a final, necessary chance to contain the plague before it consumed the entire world. 2 years into his exile, Logan's internal war raged ceaselessly, a continuous, exhausting conflict with no ceasefire. The scarlet rot was a constant, debilitating white noise of pain, and the psychic residue of the 2 great runes fought relentlessly for control, threatening to consume his identity entirely and drive him into permanent, destructive savagery. He relied entirely on sheer, animal willpower and the 2 centuries of disciplined combat experience he possessed to maintain his identity, clinging to the small, stubborn core of self-control. He journeyed toward the Halig Tree, the massive ethereal citadel that hid the source of the rot, a place of perverse, sublime beauty. The landscape of the Halig Tree was deceptively serene, but the air was thick with the concentrated corruption of the plague, a sweet, sickly smell of decay. Logan wore his crude armor and cloak, a figure of grim, barely contained determination moving through the serene, yet inherently dangerous, architecture of the tree. He reached the base of the massive, ethereal Halig Tree, finding the environment strangely beautiful, but permeated by the sickly, sweet odor of decay. He found Malenia, the blade of Miquella, resting in the heart of the tree, protecting the slumbering form of her brother within a golden cocoon. She was a figure of tragic, cold beauty, her perfect prosthetic form hiding the ultimate conceptual horror of the scarlet rot she harbored. Logan approached her openly, his hands empty, his stance non-aggressive, radiating only grim, weary certainty. His aim was not to fight, but to appeal to her sense of duty, soldier to soldier. "You are the source of the plague that killed the general," Logan said, his voice quiet but raw, devoid of anger, filled only with resignation. "You're spreading this sickness everywhere. You're a weapon that can't be controlled, a living instrument of mass destruction." Melania opened her eyes, a flicker of cold, terrifying attention fixed on him, assessing his threat level. "I have never known defeat," she stated, her voice crystalline, precise, and unwavering, a perfect empty bell. "I am the sword of Miquella. I do what is required to protect him. You are an alien, saturated with war and madness. You have no part in this world's conflict, no grace, no destiny. I have a part in every conflict where an innocent gets hurt," Logan retorted, his tone devoid of threat, filled only with grim conviction. "You think you're protecting him, but you're just spreading a god's filth. You're a monster trying to be a hero, just like me. You're cursed by the power you carry." Her silence was the only response. The attempt at diplomacy, the appeal to common military duty, had failed. She would not abandon her sacred, self-imposed duty. Logan realized he had to push her, to find the limits of her resolve, to confirm the true, devastating nature of her power. He roared, a sound of pure, unbridled fury, his claws snapping out and charged, moving with the impossible speed of a man who no longer feared death. Melania moved, not with speed, but with impossible, perfect precision. She executed the waterfowl dance, a terrifying sequence of strikes that seemed to defy the laws of space and time, her body becoming a blur of razor-sharp, decaying motion. Logan was shredded instantly, his flesh cut into 1,000 pieces, the adamantium skeleton the only thing that held the mass of meat and muscle together. He felt the cold, sharp slice of her blade bypass his healing factor momentarily, the wounds appearing before he could even register the movement or the pain. He collapsed, a heap of regenerating muscle, blood, and shredded clothes. The waterfowl dance was the most precise, most focused, and most devastating physical assault Logan had ever experienced in his long life. It was not merely a physical attack, it was the conceptual perfection of the blade applied to a physical form. Logan's healing factor worked furiously, reconstructing his body from the skeletal scaffolding up, pouring every last ounce of energy into the impossible repair. It took 30 agonizing minutes for him to fully regenerate and stand up again, his body steaming with the effort. He saw the rot spores that coated Melania's blade, recognizing that if the attack had lasted even 1 second longer, the conceptual decay would have overwhelmed his healing factor completely, resulting in a permanent, absolute death. He had survived purely through the short duration of the attack and the sheer unstoppable speed of his regeneration. Logan went back on the offensive, not out of blind rage, but out of grim, cold determination. He knew her pattern now. The waterfowl dance was immensely powerful, but it required a brief, precise wind-up, a moment of stillness before the storm. He used the cramped terrain, forcing her to fight in the tight area around Miquella's cocoon. He attacked low, aiming not for a kill, but for a disruption, using his claws to scrape and momentarily disrupt her perfect balance. He continued this brutal, self-destructive cycle for 48 hours, taking damage that would vaporize armies, purely to exhaust her and force her to realize the futility of fighting an opponent who could not be defeated by physical means. Finally, in a desperate last-chance charge, Logan landed a devastating, decisive blow. He drove both his adamantium fists, claws retracted, into Melania's prosthetic arm, leveraging his massive, dense adamantium weight to shatter the joint at the elbow. The perfect, rot-coated blade dropped with a clatter to the ground, and Melania collapsed immediately, not from fatal injury, but from pure, absolute, physical and spiritual exhaustion. Logan stood over her, his body steaming with the immense effort of constant regeneration, his eyes burning with the fading, feral light of the berserker rage. They lay there, both utterly broken, two cursed warriors, neither capable of delivering a final, absolute blow. Melania looked up at the impossible monster of a man, her eyes filled with a strange, fleeting mix of shock and respect, seeing a fellow prisoner of perpetual violence. "You cannot be killed," she whispered, her voice strained and defeated. Logan let out a low, humorless grunt, his throat raw. "And you can't stop fighting. We're both cursed, sister." He had failed to destroy the source of the rot, but he had survived the impossible, earning a momentary fragile truce through mutual devastation. He retreated from the Halig tree, knowing the true, final threat still awaited him, the power that could truly deliver destined death. 4 years into his continuous, agonizing exile, Logan was a barely functional shell of his former self, a figure of pure, relentless endurance. The internal battle against the scarlet rot had permanently degraded his healing factor, forcing it to consume vast amounts of energy simply to maintain the fragile integrity of his organs. The psychic warfare with the combined voices of Godric's vanity and Radahn's war madness had created a deafening, continuous hum of agony in his skull, pushing him to the absolute, razor-thin edge of a berserker rage that he knew, if unleashed, would consume the lands between entirely. He was driven by one final, desperate, absolute mission: to find Malekith, the Black Blade, the one being in this dying world who commanded the conceptual force of destined death. Logan knew that only this true, final, ultimate death could bypass his adamantium skeleton and his unique healing factor, delivering the necessary, permanent release he had sought for over 2 centuries. He sought the final, ultimate power to end his own endless, cursed existence. He arrived at Farum Azula, the collapsing city held suspended in a perpetual, impossible storm, not through some grand entrance, but through sheer, impossible climbing, scaling the exterior ruins, clinging to the broken masonry with his claws as the fierce, magical winds threatened to rip him from the sky. The air here crackled with a primal, terrifying energy, the true, raw power of the Elden Ring before it was shattered. Logan fought through the ancient, feral beastmen and the grotesque, flying harpies, his movements driven by pure animalistic efficiency, every motion an economy of violence designed to preserve his rapidly dwindling internal strength. His destination was the massive, ornate bridge and the great chamber where Malekith stood guard. The Black Blade, the very concept of finality in this world, held captive in the form of a mournful, massive beast-man. Logan finally found the chamber, the massive arena where Malekith paced, his 2 forms, the beast clergyman and the Black Blade, flickering between each other like a terrible, physical manifestation of fate. Logan did not charge. He stopped 20 feet from the gargantuan figure and addressed him directly, his voice raw, hoarse, and filled with grim respect for the monumental, tragic duty of the Sentinel. "I'm not here for your ring," Logan growled, his body tense, his claws extended, ready for the inevitable violence. "I'm here for the only thing you possess that I need. Destined death. I want you to kill me, beast. End it." Malekith paused his pacing, the flickering between his forms momentarily stilling. His eyes, ancient and filled with profound, inescapable sorrow, locked onto Logan's, recognizing the desperate plea, the honest demand for finality in the eyes of the man covered in scars that refused to stay healed. The beast clergyman simply spoke, his voice a low, heavy rumble that shook the massive chamber. "Only the power of the rune of death can end the endless cycle. It is not for you to wield, nor to receive casually. You are an endless weapon, foreign to this world, yet your grief is recognized. You seek the finality all living things deserve." The clergyman shifted, fully transforming into Malekith, the Black Blade, his massive ornate sword, Gurun, now crackling with the terrifying, conceptual power of the Rune of Death. The fight began with a devastating display of ultimate power. Malekith struck, his great sword not merely cutting, but applying the conceptual force of destined death itself. The blade connected with Logan's chest, a strike that, in any other scenario, would have vaporized him entirely. Instead, Logan felt the force of the blow bypass his flesh, his adamantium, and even his healing factor entirely. It was not a wound. It was the chilling, absolute feeling of his own mortality being forcibly applied to his eternal frame. His healing factor, for the first time in over 2 centuries, failed completely to counter the effect. The black flame of the rune of death began to burn the wound, not with heat, but with conceptual decay, ensuring that any cells it touched could not, and would not, regenerate. Logan felt the immediate, profound, terrifying weakness that came with a truly permanent wound, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a child. He was staggered, his legs barely supporting the massive weight of his skeleton, his internal reserves plummeting. But this was not the death he wanted. It was a partial success, a confirmation that he could be killed, but the wound was not immediately fatal, giving him a precious, final opportunity to push his opponent to the limit. Logan roared, a sound of absolute pain and utter profound and glorious relief, and plunged into a full, uncontrollable berserker rage. All the years of trauma, the whispers of the great runes, the maddening burn of the scarlet rot, the constant agony of his eternal healing, it all broke free, shattering the fragile barriers of his will. He was no longer Logan, or Wolverine, or James Howlett. He was just the beast, a pure, unstoppable engine of violence. He charged Malekith, not caring about defense, attacking with a desperate, savage, suicidal ferocity that overwhelmed even the Black Blade's discipline. Logan launched himself directly at Malekith, slicing and hacking with blinding, terrifying speed, landing multiple impossible blows on the Sentinel's exposed joints and tendons. Malekith was forced onto the defensive, pushed back by the sheer, overwhelming, suicidal aggression of the raging beast. Logan knew this fury would burn him out, but he didn't care. He landed a final, devastating, precise blow, slicing the tendon of Malekith's sword arm, forcing the Black Blade to drop his weapon, Gurun, with a terrible, crashing sound. Logan collapsed, the destructive fury spent, the beast momentarily exhausted, his body covered in wounds that were no longer healing. Malekith stood over him, holding the Black Blade in his good arm, mournful, and recognizing the pure tragedy of the foreign warrior's end. "You have earned your rest," the beast clergyman rumbled, his voice filled with ancient sorrow. Malekith then delivered the final, fatal, merciful strike, plunging the conceptual blade, crackling with destined death, deep into the center of Logan's adamantium heart. The sensation of destined death was not pain, but an absolute, sudden, profound void. The black flame consumed his consciousness instantly, bypassing the adamantium, overriding the healing factor entirely, and extinguishing the spark of his perpetual life. For a precious, glorious moment, Logan felt nothing. He felt the pure, absolute, necessary peace he had been seeking for 2 centuries, the final silence after a lifetime of constant screaming. His massive, heavy body collapsed onto the scarred stone of Farum Azula, completely still. The beast clergyman stood over him, his head bowed, recognizing the true sorrow of this death, the death of a man who fought his entire life simply for the right to cease existing. He knew Logan was not of this world, yet his desperate, noble desire for finality was acknowledged by the beast clergyman's deep, ancient duty. The clergyman, knowing that such a unique entity, foreign to the laws of the lands between, could not simply dissolve into golden motes of grace, placed a single, small piece of deathroot upon Logan's still chest, a silent tribute to the warrior's absolute, brutal will. But the finality, the beautiful, ultimate silence, did not last. Logan was not allowed to die. His healing factor, the most ancient, powerful, and fundamental part of his being, was not a simple biological function that could be overridden by a single, permanent wound. It was a conceptual, intrinsic part of his very existence, a force of nature tied to the adamantium that held his bones together. The death administered by Malekith was absolute, destroying the spiritual core and the regenerative cells of his flesh, but the adamantium skeleton itself, the very anchor of his existence, was not merely physical, it was metaphysically linked to his power. An hour later, with a terrible rasping gasp, Logan was violently, agonizingly ripped back to a horrifying form of existence. The conceptual wound from the black blade remained, a permanent black hole of death in his chest that refused to heal, constantly leaking his life force and his identity, but the healing factor was already trying to override even this absolute finality. It began to build tissue around the wound, not healing it, but attempting to encapsulate the wound of destined death itself, an impossible feat of biological defiance. Logan was now a living, agonizing paradox, a man perpetually dying, held in perpetual, agonizing existence by a force that refused to let him rest. He was weak, fundamentally damaged, and profoundly changed. The rot was still burning in his veins, the great runes were still screaming in his head, and now, a conceptual wound was actively destroying him from the inside out, forcing his healing factor into an impossible, desperate struggle for a survival he no longer desired. This horrifying survival brought a terrifying, ultimate clarity. Logan realized the berserker rage he had unleashed in the fight against Malekith was the only weapon he had left, the only power capable of overriding his cursed existence. If he couldn't achieve final, permanent death, he could achieve absolute, final destruction. He decided to burn his life force, to push his healing factor past the point of no return, forcing a total, catastrophic collapse of his entire system, leveraging his own internal decay to become a force of ultimate annihilation. He would not just kill himself, he would self-destruct, taking a piece of this rotten world with him. He retrieved his claws, the adamantium cutting through the stone of the battlefield, and staggered away from the scene. His path set toward Leyndell, the royal capital, the physical and conceptual heart of the rotting kingdom. He knew that the massive release of psychic energy required to trigger the total system collapse had to be directed at the single, most important nexus of power in the lands between. Leyndell was the epicenter of the shattering, the seat of the demigods, and the final place where he could unleash his absolute, destructive fury. He spent the next month slowly, painfully recovering enough strength to make the journey, feeding his broken body on scavenged meat, surviving through sheer, impossible will. He fashioned crude leather harnesses around his torso, compressing the wound of destined death to slow the immediate leakage of his life force, focusing all his remaining power on controlling the inevitable explosion. He was now an engine of violence waiting for its final detonation, a suicide bomber of flesh, adamantium, and pure rage. He was ready to end it all. 5 years after his arrival, Logan finally reached Leyndell, the royal capital, the massive, sprawling city bathed in the sickly, omnipresent golden light of the Erd Tree. He was no longer a man. He was a walking, barely contained disaster, a force of nature driven by pure, absolute, all-consuming fury. The combination of the two great runes, the scarlet rot infection, the constant agony of the internal unhealable wound, and the decades of suppressed trauma finally, completely broke him. Logan unleashed the berserker rage in its ultimate, final form. It was not a simple surge of adrenaline, but a total system collapse of his psyche, driven by a catastrophic, impossible expenditure of his healing factor's energy. His eyes glowed with feral, absolute gold, his body moved with impossible, devastating speed, and his 6 adamantium claws became a continuous blur of unstoppable, lethal destruction. He did not use the main gate. He climbed the wall, slicing through the massive, fortified stone with his claws like hot butter, leaving a path of impossible, smoking destruction in his wake. Logan roared a sound that was less human and more the primal shriek of an eternally suffering animal as he plunged into the crowded streets of Leyndell. The Golden Order knights and the massive Tarnished soldiers guarding the streets reacted with immediate, predictable, but utterly ineffective force. They had never encountered a threat like this, a foe who did not fight for glory or power, but for the fundamental, ultimate destruction of everything around him. The knight's steel armor, designed to withstand the blows of colossal beasts, offered less resistance than thick cloth to Logan's adamantium claws. He was an absolute, unstoppable blender of violence, tearing through ranks of highly disciplined soldiers in seconds, leaving behind only smoking debris and pools of rapidly cooling blood. He fought like an entity possessed, his internal engines screaming in agony, his healing factor burning itself out to sustain this impossible terminal burst of activity. He was collapsing his own system, driving himself to a permanent end through the very act of absolute violence. He reached the main courtyard, the massive sacred space beneath the towering Erd tree, and confronted the draconic tree sentinel, a massive, formidable knight riding an armored, fire-breathing dragon. The sight of the sentinel's power and sheer arrogance fueled Logan's final, absolute fury. Logan did not attack the knight. He attacked the dragon, the greater, more powerful creature, seeking to disable the magical threat first. He leaped onto the massive beast, burying his claws deep into its thick, scaled hide, using his adamantium weight to maintain his purchase, enduring the punishing, concussive swings of the sentinel's massive hammer. He sliced through the dragon's wings and legs, turning the flying terror into a crippled, raging, grounded beast. He finished the beast by plunging his claws into its primary neck and snapping its spine with a single, savage twist of his immense, adamantium-enhanced strength. He turned his attention to the draconic tree sentinel himself, who reacted with a desperate, devastating, magical blast of fire. Logan ran directly toward the fire, embracing the lethal heat, his exposed body searing and regenerating in the blast, a true phoenix of rage and agony. He was on the knight in a heartbeat, his claws tearing through the sentinel's golden armor in one continuous, unstoppable motion, ripping the man from the back of his dying dragon and throwing him against the stone facade of the main palace. Logan finished the sentinel with a single, massive, brutal slice to the throat, a final, definitive end to the threat. His berserker rage was now at its absolute terrifying peak, a self-imposed nuclear explosion of sheer, absolute, concentrated violence. He ran, not walking, not stumbling, but running with the impossible speed of a man in his final, ultimate moments, directly toward the massive golden doors of the Erd tree, the sacred, powerful heart of the rotting kingdom. He knew that the ultimate death he sought could only be achieved by completely destroying the very concept of the world's persistence. He was the perfect, cursed instrument of this world's destruction. The sheer, concentrated force of Logan's berserker rage finally allowed him to breach the massive golden seals of the Erd tree's main entrance, something that only the most powerful demigods or the Elden Lord himself could accomplish. He ripped and tore his way into the gilded hall, his claws slicing through the thick, magical wood and the reinforced golden metal like tissue paper. He had reached the absolute heart of the lands between, the one place where he could unleash the total catastrophic collapse of his system. The Erd tree was a structure of impossible, sublime golden beauty, radiating a vast, oppressive, fundamental grace that seemed to mock his existence and his pain. Logan stopped, his massive body trembling violently, his gold eyes wide with pure, absolute, final rage. The internal war against the two great runes and the scarlet rot was finally, completely overwhelming his system, pushing him past the physical and conceptual limits of his life. He knew this was the end. He had reached the point of no return. Logan let out a final, raw, bone-deep, guttural roar, not of aggression, but of pure, profound release and absolute acceptance of his fate. He plunged all 6 of his adamantium claws, with every last ounce of his remaining strength and internal energy, deep into his own massive chest, deliberately striking the core of his sternum and the permanent, unhealing wound left by Malekith's conceptual blade. This was the final, devastating act of self-destruction, leveraging the very force that refused to let him die to ensure his end. The massive, contained energy of his berserker rage, the latent power of the great runes, and the corrosive force of the scarlet rot all erupted from the self-inflicted, central wound simultaneously. A catastrophic, contained nuclear explosion of magic, decay, and adamantium-fueled life force. The resulting blast was not physical, but conceptual. A wave of pure, dark energy, mixed with the toxic, corrosive essence of the scarlet rot, surged outward from Logan's chest, hitting the sacred heart of the Erd Tree with the force of 1,000 simultaneous, psychic hammer blows. The massive, fundamental grace that radiated from the tree was momentarily, violently disrupted by this impossible, alien corruption. The very concept of the Golden Order shook, the roots of the tree smoking and momentarily turning black under the corrosive, destructive power of the absolute rage and decay that Logan had forced upon himself. The psychic, contained explosion was so powerful that it momentarily shattered the spectral golden seal of the Erd Tree, causing a massive, audible crack that echoed across the entire lands between. A final testament to the destructive power of the mutant warrior's will. Logan's body, the incredible machine of flesh and indestructible metal, could not survive the intentional, total, and complete collapse of its primary systems. The massive release of energy that breached the Erd Tree finally overwhelmed the last, desperate attempts of his healing factor to rebuild and persist. Logan fell, his dense body hitting the ornate golden floor of the Erd Tree with a heavy, final, absolute crash. The adamantium claws retracted for the final time, sinking back into his knuckles with a silent click. His eyes, which had been glowing with feral gold, faded to a simple, dull, dead brown, completely empty. The black flame of destined death finally consumed the last stubborn spark of his cursed life. He was completely, utterly, and finally still. Logan was not of this world. He did not dissolve into golden motes of grace, nor did he reappear at a site of grace. He simply lay there, a massive, muscular, scarred figure, his body a permanent, unmoving monument to his own final, desperate, noble, and necessary death. The adamantium curse was finally, completely broken, and Wolverine had finally, permanently, found the silence he had sought for over 2 centuries. His saga was over.